this History on the Edge lecture with Anna Nakai. I will introduce her briefly. And then she will give the presentation Sporadic Trajectory of Eastern European Thought, Postwar Japanese Intellectuals and Their Source of Alternative Ideas. So Anna is a research fellow and part-time lecturer for the Institute of Global Area Studies of Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, or TAFS, where she teaches for the History in the Public Sphere program. And after obtaining her master's degree from University of Warsaw, she moved to Budapest, where we met a decade ago, where she enrolled in the doctoral program of the Central European University History Department. And she conducted then research at academic institutions such as the Research Center for Eastern European Studies in Bremen, the Herder Institute for Eastern European History in Marburg, and the German-Polish Institute in Darmstadt. She published numerous articles on Central and Eastern European history in Japanese, and her current research covers the cultural and intellectual history of contemporary Central Europe, with a particular focus on the late socialist underground, educational movements, and dissident thought in Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland. She co-edited the collected volumes Unsettled 1968 in the Troubled Present, revisioning the 50 years of discussions from East and Central Europe, and Voicing Memories, Unearthing Identities, Studies in the 21st Century Literature of Eastern and East Central Europe. Our region has very long names. We are very, very happy, Anna, to have you here today, and very much looking forward to your lecture, after which we will have a discussion.
Okay, thank you very much for the kind introduction, the invitation, and the nice poster, the great coffee, panettone, and the cookies. I arrived only yesterday and have already enjoyed all of this within 2 days. It has been wonderful already. I often invest a lot in presentation slides, and it was often the case, and this time again I contain too much information. So I recommend anyone who are interested in looking at the slides more closely, accessing them through this code, so that you can read the details on your smartphones actually. I will also put the link in the Zoom chat or I think maybe someone can share the slide in the Zoom chat, that's okay. While you're downloading them, let me add a brief disclaimer. Adela introduced me nicely, and you probably noticed that I'm primarily a historian of East Central Europe. I come from Japan, but that doesn't automatically makes me an expert on Japanese post-war history. But since last year or 2 years ago, I have started a related project and have been learning more about this field. So my knowledge still is very partial and limited, but I will do my best to answer your questions when it comes to the discussion. I also do not present this as a finished research result or project or something like that. Instead, I would like to present this as a source of food for thought, and to think together with you about what we can do with this kind of material. So it's a very open-ended questions I'm gonna pose. So my guiding question today is the top question. So what does the sporadic reception of Eastern European thought reveal about the unresolved problems of post-war Japan? Two things are kind of packed into this question. So the first is sporadic reception signals my refusals of a linear story. I'm not negating the existence of a stable tradition of Eastern European studies in Japan. There are numbers of my colleagues and friends who are working on the field, but such specialists certainly exist, but my focus lies elsewhere. I'm interested in these continuities, odd parallels, scattered points of contact, episodic fascinations, and the moments when Eastern European thought suddenly became relevant. Second thing in this question is the target of analysis is post-war Japan's unresolved conditions and constraints. So these includes democratization under occupation, the persistence of imperial legacies, tensions between pacifism and the Cold War alignment, and also the repeated difficulties and the numbers of difficulties of articulating political agency without secure points of reference. So that is the things that I want to ask by these questions. So this talk follows or proceeds in 4 steps. I begin with my point of departure and the clarification of some terminology. And next, I outline a shared timeline and introduce 3 protagonists. This is followed by analytical episodes of reception. And I conclude by summarizing the 3 cases a little bit schematically and proposing discussion questions. So this project originates in my own experience of reading translations of Eastern Central European authors. When I was a MA student, I took an Erasmus semester in Prague, and there was a course on East Central European political thought and encountered authors many of you know and read: Czesław Miłosz, Milovan Djilas, Karel Kosik, Adam Schaff, George Conrad, Ivan Sereny, etc., etc. I first read most of them in English because it was a course in English, but only later, during my PhD years, I realized that many of these works had been actually translated into Japanese long before I learned their names. So the slides list Japanese kind of publication years next to the original years of publication. So the Miłosz written his Captive Mind in 1950, published in 1953, already translated right next year, 1954. And even Milovan Djilas, right after the publication, translated, already available in Japanese, and so on. Later, the last one, Conrad and Sereny, of course, there was a bit of a gap in the years, but the delay was often not very long, as you can see. And one absence maybe is worth noting. I don't know if you see these 5 names or 5 important books. Like, for instance, Radvan Rifter is missing here, but his works were widely discussed and cited in Japan. So even though there's no book-length translation appeared, this doesn't always suggest this doesn't automatically suggest the lack of reception, let's say. So concepts and ideas can circulate without sometimes shaping or taking some practice, and some names can become very fashionable at one point, while their historical contexts are often ignored. So here, I need to clarify how I use the terms translation and reception. In Japan, actually, translation has long been an ontological issue, intellectually ontological issue, especially since the rapid modernization of the late 19th century, when concepts such as society, economy, philosophy, science, and freedom were imported, translated, and introduced only then. Here, however, I use translation in a broader historical sense. Following the formulation of the Japanese Cold War historian Masuda Hajime, according to his definition, translation refers to the process by which events and ideas that occurred elsewhere are interpreted within a specific local historical experience, social context, and the set of memories. And the elsewhere here is never received in a pure or correct form. So always there is it's as if processed data, and always the information is selective and often based on misunderstandings. So this is already connotated in the meaning of interpretation, or no, translation, excuse me. And the reception here are used by contrast refers to what happens after this translation process. So it denotes the assignment of roles and meanings to translated ideas under concrete historical and institutional conditions. So the reception takes shape only when ideas are put to use. So the distinction matters because in all three cases I'm gonna discuss, there is a gap between what was translated and what was received, let's say. So the Eastern European thought here was not simply imported, it was also reassembled. Here is a very small, tiny letters, excuse me, but to clarify the period I am discussing, I juxtapose three timelines here. Japanese timeline, East Central European timeline, and the world timeline. I will focus on several key points from the Japanese timeline because I think you know the two of the latter timelines very well. So August 1945 marked the Japanese defeat and the beginning of the Allied occupation, largely administered by the US-led General Headquarters. In 1947, under the occupation, a new constitution was enacted, and that constitution was characterized by popular sovereignty and pacifism. It kind of renounced war as a means of resolving conflicts and prohibited the possession of armed forces, although Japan later established the self-defense force, so-called. But we don't call it the army, national army. It is not. Until sovereignty was restored in 1952, occupation policies shifted in line with the US Cold War priorities. So the so-called Red Purge institutionalized anti-communism, particularly in labor and educational field. A symbolic moment was the ban of May Day celebrations in 1951, although later you could continue May Day celebrations. It is tempting to compare this process to a process of democratization and de-imperialization with early Sovietization in East Central European context. However, Japan's 1947 constitution wasn't equivalent to the 1948 and 1949, let's say, communist takeover in Eastern Europe. The difference is important and worth keeping in mind. I will tell, maybe we can discuss it later, or I will tell something about it later. And I would like to emphasize the short period between roughly 1947 and 1950, when political ideas and options were unusually fluid. Unlike regions liberated by the Red Army, Japan's future course was not yet fully fixed by the US priorities in those very brief open window time. In the 1949 general election, for instance, the Japanese Communist Party, JCP, won 35 seats with almost 10% of the vote ratio. It gained a kind of moral credibility, or it gave the moral credibility to the JCP, and because it had, why this happened? Because it had consistent, the Communist Party was the only party consistently opposed the war and defended the principle of the peace, and because it had been suppressed during the pre-war period as well. So the many ordinary people hoped for lasting peace rather than demilitarization under US-led security framework. In this context, numerous books on communism were published actually. Not always they have the anti-communist tone. Some were even criticized liberal democracy. And this book just I would like to introduce is a book entitled Communism or Democracy. So it's kind of posing a very big question. And this book questioned kind of both camps, raised the doubts on the both sides of the Cold War camps. And its underlying tone was very pacifist and shaped by the experience of the civilian killing by the atomic bombing and so on. So this was a kind of a very interesting highlight of that period. The Cold War discourse in Japan in this way emerged with a very strong moral and interpretative dimension. Eastern Europe entered, and here, in this space, not only through the theory, but through the geopolitical, fair, or ideological fragmentation. So early post-war Japan marked a brief plurality, as I said, but institutional reforms were introduced in the name of democratization, and this red purge was institutionalized, and the political choices were soon narrowed down by Cold War tone. And within this framework, I focused on 3 moments of reception. So I highlighted in pink, purple, and blue. And here are associated with my 3 protagonists. So the first protagonist, so the 3 names appeared here. Hariu Ichiro. I wrote down in the order of Japanese, the surname first following the first name, and the second one, Hanazaki Kohei, and the third one, Kudo Yukio. I do not treat them as a very representative figures of fixed ideas or very big school of thought or anything like that. Instead, they serve as kind of perspectives or lenses through which we can identify different modes of reception. And for instance, the first one, Hariu, in the early 1950s, stood at the intersection of art criticism, architecture, and post-war conversion. Hanazaki, for instance, in the 1960s and 70s, he moved away from the very orthodox Marxism toward Marxist humanism, and later he became activist. Lifelong activist. He's still alive. In the 1980s, the Kudo, the third one, worked primarily as a translator and author of numbers of books, but he organized, he also functioned as organizer of involved reception of Polish solidarity movement. All 3 occupied very different positions in the Japanese intellectual, let's say, history, and all 3 occupied very amphibious positions. Connected to the all 3 of them actually taught at the certain universities, but they are connected to not only academia, journalism, activism, publishing, and intellectual circles in a very different way. And they never contained, they were never free contained in any of them. None of them, except perhaps Kudo, the last one, who was recognized as a kind of a very famous specialist who translated Miłosz, Mrożek, Lem, Stanisław Lem, and all other kinds of notable Polish authors. Maybe no one considers the other ones as Eastern European specialists. And even Kudo originally was educated in the French department, so he learned Russian and then Polish by himself, most of all. So these figures were actually contemporaries, you may notice, like they were born around almost the same time. But their formative years were spent outside Japan's main cultural center, which was Tokyo or Kyoto. So Hariu, for instance, was born in Miyagi Prefecture, the pink spot on the map. Kudo in Dalian, a former imperial port city of Russia and Japan, now today's Russia. Today's China. And Hanazaki studied and settled in Hokkaido, although he was from Tokyo. And all those regions has its own particular history, and especially I could say some kind of colonial undertone you could see there. This is a map of 1926, which means this was almost so as you could see in the map, there is Taiwan included in Japan, and the Korean Peninsula included in Japan, and certain port cities of China included as in the Japanese map. And you could tell a lot of the things from this map. And let's say, and this Hokkaido on the northern island part of Japan, together with this Sakhalin, part of the Sakhalin, which we had, which the Japan, it would belong to the Japanese territory to a certain point of the history, was, let's say, they are. This was also the part that in the late 19th century, the modernization period kind of took over by the central Japan. So you could see a lot of colonial elements in this map. And their biographies also reflect this kind of imperial legacies that shaped post-war debates on the people, let's say the concept of the people, nation, and the culture. And Eastern Europe functioned maybe as a distant yet a usable point of reference for reimagining social realities. That's what I would like to show with some examples. So the first case concerns Hariu Ichiro, the art critic, and his engagement with the Hungarian big debate. In 1953, Hariu translated Leva Georgiev's essay, Architecture, Tradition, and Modernism. This essay on the picture, originally published in the East German journal Aufbau. So he used the German text to translate it. But I will tell you that the original was, of course, in Hungarian, and it was put in a different context. So its Japanese publication sparked the debate, actually, among artists and architects. And Levi's text raised questions of tradition, national specificity, and the people, the concept of the people within socialist realist discourse. Although Japanese architects ultimately chose, let's say, the counterpart, international modernism, but this decision was not self-evident at the time. So, and this is a clear example of this divergence between translation and reception, I would say. Because Hungarian intervention shaped by Stalinist culture, politics at that time became, in Japan, a kind of a catalyst for debates about the national tradition and the unresolved legitimacy of the imperial past. The original Hungarian debate took place in 1951. I go back to the original debate at the politically commissioned cultural plenary. It was a struggle over cultural governance and the socialism. I would say I can characterize maybe this debate as such, and it was not just about architecture. So citing Moscow metro stations as ambitious combinations of folklore and the socialist idea, this Levi, the cultural kind of big figure in this Hungarian Communist Party, promoted a nationally specific architecture, rejecting both Soviet imitation and pure type of pure modernist decadence. And on the other hand, there was a Hungarian, International Congress of Architecture, CIAM, I think this international organization, and he was the head of the Hungarian CIAM, Mate Major. He defended the modernist architecture, and his defense can be read as a kind of a protection of professional autonomy over the functional logic. And in a Stalinist political setting, however, this debate was politically suppressed, and Levi kind of continued in his position as the doyen of Hungarian cultural administration. So it was just kind of took over by the party line, let's say. And the context here in Japan, why this became an important subject is important. Important subject is I explain here. In early post-war Japan, there was an intense discussion of subjectivity closely tied to the questions of imperial legacy, and this type of question formed part of the background for the fascination with the Hungarian case. So for post-war intellectuals, Levi's combination of this national style and the new social aesthetics fit well with their concerns about continuity and rupture right after the Second World War. Hallyu, in particular, belonged to the late war generation of former militarized youth. So he was a kind of oldest high school student in the old school system when he kind of met the end of the Second World War. But he said he reflected himself as a very militarized youth. And he was educated also in a very pre-war elite high school. And with this kind of education, hijacked by the militarist ideology, many of them actually, like including Hallyu, experienced a lot of guiding principles in the early post-war period and subsequently chose the path to communism, many of them actually. And Hallyu also joined the Japanese Communist Party at some point in the early post-war time. And this slide also visually try to make some references. So perhaps you know the Skopje city center project right after the earthquake in Skopje in Macedonia. And this was, for instance, kind of a reminder of what is the rupture and the continuity in the Japanese architectural context. So let's say there was a very internationally famous architect, Tange Kenzo, and actually architecture and art are the kind of the field that were very much collaborating with the wartime experience. So let's say so there are people who are exactly commissioned the monuments of the, let's say, colonial monuments during the early 1940s, could be a leading architect of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Center in right after the war. So this kind of, so their collaboration was never be, let's say, due of responsibility, or they were kind of, let's say, there were also shortage of the experts and the people. So there was a very much, how to say, the continuity of at least the number of the people who had actually direct experience of the colonial input, then continued their work right after the end of the World War. So on the one hand, this kind of war responsibility was processed very unevenly in the early post-war period. And on the other hand, there was a genuine demand for new aesthetics, new social aesthetics. And in this case, exactly this Hungarian example happened to provide a sort of model case of discussion. Okay, now we move on to a little bit later time, 1960s to 1970s. And here I introduce the second example concerning this time period when global upheavals also reached the Far East. So in post-war Japan, the trend of Marxist humanism, represented by figures such as Roger Garaudy or Ernst Fischer, and so on among Western names, was received as an alternative to party-centered Marxism and Stalinist orthodoxy. It offered ways to address the concepts like alienation, ethics, and human agency within a rapidly changing social environment. So for Hanazaki, the second guy, and some others, Marxist humanism functioned less as a doctrinal position than as a very critical resource for thinking about society and the individual. Again, this serves as an important reference point from the Eastern European case, because there are some people who are focusing more on the Western thinkers, but some of them picked up the East Central European thinkers. And actually at that time, numerous titles and articles were published on this subject. Although its overall impact, I would have to say that it remained very limited and largely confined to left-leaning intellectual circles. So it didn't lead to a wider audience, but still, I must say, let's say, like 7 books from Adam Schaff were translated, and that's a lot already. Yes, even for 2 decades. So this reception also happened in the context of the 1960s political mobilization. So the student movements, peace activism, and the experience of the global 60s. Still, there are major differences between Europe and East Asia, shaped by the actual hot wars like Korean Wars and the Vietnam War, and we experienced wars right away. So it wasn't called for us to have exact like large military operations were often everywhere, like all the time. So while various forms of humanism attracted specific generations of people, there were indeed more urgent political tasks which dominated the region. And this Marxist trend from East Central Europe or some of the European socialists tended to remain more or less like a very bookish, rarely materializing as direct political intervention. And of course, as you know, the original context of Marxist humanism, I think I'm saying everything here may have nonsense. As you know very well, Marxist humanism emerged as an internal critique of socialist regimes rather than as external opposition. And thinkers such as Karel Koschik, Adam Schaff, and others, they recentered Marxism on human emancipations, alienation, and everyday questions of the social life. So this current of the thought circulated across the Iron Curtain, though books and personal contacts were also there. They facilitated the East-West dialogue, but it remained politically vulnerable to a certain extent and was increasingly suppressed after 1968 or the late 1960s. Of particular importance was this East-West circulation or East-West dialogue, I would say, characterized, edited volumes by Erich Fromm or something like that. These kind of things functioned as a mediating devices, and the Eastern European Marxist humanism became accessible to the Western leaders and therefore to the Japanese leaders as well, because they often read German, French, but not Polish, Czech, Romanian, other languages. While Western critical vocabularies absorbed and reframed these ideas, still some original ideas moved through institutions, editors, languages, and these Cold War binaries. Japan, however, was of course no Western Europe or even no Europe. What was primarily translated into Japanese or Japan from this Marxist humanism trend were theoretical resources. So as I said, the concept of alienation and human agency and responsibility were very much highlighted. And what was received, for instance, in case of Hanazaki, in his life and work, became an ethical practice. So how to sustain political commitment without reproducing very stiff ideological use of power, and how to craft a humanist practice outside the traditional state-centered vocabulary. So that was his concern. And Hanazaki's trajectory was marked by his departure from academic life and following the conflicts at the Hokkaido University, where he worked as a lecturer during the time of this upheaval years of the 1960s. So there was, as far as I hope that it's correct, but he wanted to defend one student, and that's why he decided to quit the university. So he retracted himself, and from that point on, resonating with both his own generation and the younger ones, and all kinds of inequalities within the society, he moved toward peace movement, anti-war activism, and later critiques of globalization. So this is perhaps the clearest example of reception as functional transformation. So he turned into actual practice of all those. And his departure from academia was not just a biographical issue. It demonstrates how reception can be shaped by institutional constraints when one seeks to express and confront injustice. So Marxist humanism in this case provided a vocabulary which Hanazaki individually transformed into activism. And the final example comes from the 1980s, when the rise of Polish solidarity movement generated what was often described in Japan as Lech Wałęsa fever. It attracted a diverse group of people. Actually, the Polish solidarity movement interestingly attracted a diverse group of people. First, labor unionists, of course. Japanese labor union history has its own very much complexities, so I don't go into the detail right now. But here it is very important that the support for Poland crossed ideological divisions among the unions. And second, there were now very small portion, but the Polish, so-called Polish enthusiasts, let's say, those who like Polish culture, Polish films especially, and so on, like Andrzej Wajda and so on. And some other people, including scholars with the interest in Poland. So not everyone was very much sympathetic or optimistic about the developments in Poland at that time. Still, even the general public became very much interested in this subject. So when a solidarity delegation arrived in Tokyo in May 1981, a crowd gathered at the major labor union halls, including even office workers from metropolitan banks and large corporations came to visit those places. This reflected a very much kind of imbalance or mismatch between fascination with foreign movements and Japan's highly capitalist environment, combined with the fact that this was also the period when many Japanese began traveling abroad and start consuming foreign goods supported by a strong currency at that point. In this environment, Poland Monthly, this journal, periodical, which dedicated to introducing Polish samizdat writings, became a crucial platform for those who are sympathetic to Poland. It was not grounded in any institutional framework, this periodical was, but functioned as a hub connecting intellectuals, journalists, and activists interested in Eastern Europe. And the Kudo, the third guy, Kudo Yukio, he served as the project's main animator, connecting people and also editing and directing the contents for each issue. Actually, this Poland Monthly, this is the topic I'm investigating right now, and it started right around the time of the martial law, and they continued every month, literally almost every month. Sometimes they combined the 2 months together, but almost every month for 11 years until 1991. So this is a very much a dedicated work. And yes, several elements here are worth highlighting. So the first element is here. The form of reception quite changed from the two other cases. In the first two cases, let's say, reception was anchored in the text and intellectual engagement. But in this case, in this Polish solidarity case, it was anchored in a certain political movement and its media infrastructure. So the periodical didn't merely serve as a channel, it created a kind of community of leaders who shared a sense of urgency shaped by the Polish case within the global Cold War tensions. And the second point is that solidarity movement or solidarity in general arrived in Japan at a particular moment. This was late Cold War, a period of Japan's mature economic power and the domestic environment often described as very politically stagnant or structurally depoliticized. In this context, solidarity appeared as a kind of let's say, revival or revision of political agency. So obviously, Japanese support for Polish solidarity movement was embedded in a wider transnational networks of Polish support groups, which happened, for instance, in UK, France, Belgium, and Eastern Bloc countries such as Hungary too. So intellectuals, trade unionists, like professors, publishers, and cultural figures mobilized themselves around the movement through political advocacy, and the cultural activists such as publishing, they engage in demonstrations, public lectures, and journalism. And of course, ordinary people like Polish diaspora community, for instance, participated in these activities. This situates Japan within a broader European and transnational support ecology, let's say network of support ecology. But Japan wasn't an isolated case, but part of a networked phenomenon in which support took multiple forms. And nevertheless, in Japan, solidarity support group was mixed, very much mixed in its nature. So it was partly political, but largely cultural, I would say. So with no substantial Polish diaspora community, the Japanese perspective on solidarity movement differed from European counterparts and required extensive mediation in between. And Kudo, for instance, was in this case functioned really as a mediator. Publishing a monthly periodical, as I said, of 30 to 40 pages with extensive translation and foreign political coverage without the time without internet, this required enormous effort, actually. So Poland Monthly was clearly the work of passionate individuals. And around the 1980s, this kind of self-publishing and cultural movements, hobby activities of publishing became increasingly common among Japanese wider generations. Of course, on that one end, there is, of course, comics was the most visible case, for instance, for such self-publication, but not the only one. Culture often overtook politics in this period, and publishing retained significant importance for the general public. And Kudo, he was born in a former Japanese colony, as I said, Darien, and repatriated after the war. Therefore, he kind of developed a specific sensitivity to displacement and languages. In the post-war environment, Kudo found very much his position in the cultural sphere. He studied French, as I said, at the university, later learned Russian, worked as a GHQ, this general headquarters interpreter in the early post-war years. He then made his living as a writer, translator, which led to an invitation to teach Japanese at the University of Warsaw from 1967 to 1974. There he became acquainted with various dissident figures like Jan Litinsky and Adam Michnik and so on, and his apartment became sometimes meeting spots for students and intellectuals. He positioned himself as a very much cultural mediator, as I said, between literature, translation, journalism, Polish, Japanese communication, rather than just a simple academic teaching in a university. He rarely foregrounded explicit political position of himself, though he remained closer to the certain leftist and socialist writers' club. So this represents a kind of third mode of reception, I would say. So if compared to the second case, the Hanazaki's case, Hanazaki translated the theory into the practice and the ethics of activism. Kudo, for instance, then translated politics into culture and a certain type of relational practices. Here, I would say another unresolved problem of post-war Japan kind of surfaced, which is the persistent tension between political commitment and the fear of ideological capture. So through Poland Mansi's example, this tension kind of intensified, but resulted in a moderately successful model of situating political engagement within the cultural domain. So we now reach the conclusion. So this slide summarizes 3 important points, passes from translation to the reception. So in the very first case, in Hariu's case, example 1, number 1, it was the transition from socialist realist aesthetics to debates on subjectivity in post-war Japan. So there was kind of a shift from translation to reception. And this was connected with the question how to reconcile with being critical of imperial legacies. For the second case, from Marxist to humanism as a theory to activism and ethical practice, this was related to the question how to articulate humanism outside of traditional institutional settings. And for the third case, I would say that there was a shift from personal support and hospitality and personal interest to the transnational cultural solidarity, amplifying politics through cultural mediation. So in this way, Eastern European thought and regional experiences entered Japan first as fragments, repurposed to address unresolved problems specific to each moment and position. This illustrates the meaning of a sporadic trajectory, which is the translation and the reception, rarely form the closed circle, just one small circle. Often remaining, they are one-directional, but functioning as very productive means of understanding the world. And I want to raise the discussion question, but before that, here's appendix. Before moving to the discussion, I'd like to say a few words about the reception of, let's say, Yugoslav issues, especially since we are in Ljubljana now. And Yugoslav was confronted with Japanese intellectuals, obviously during the 1990s, with conflict interpreted through the nationalism, imperial collapse, and the criticism of Western, particularly American, intervention. While sympathy for peace and anti-war position was very common, there was very limited understanding of internal dynamics of violence and ethnic cleansing and state disintegration. So the Yugoslav case kind of forced a confrontation with post-socialist violence that didn't fit the whole prescript of the democratization associated with 1989, for instance. And there's a kind of a small twist. Around the same time, let's say around the later time slightly, in 2000, the Japanese intellectual market or publication market found Zizek. He became kind of saturated with a very globally circulated theory figures. And the point is not to dismiss Zizek here. I don't want to anything to say against your fellow Slovene, but to observe a transformation in reception. So there was a kind of regionally grounded engagement throughout the Cold War time. They have limited understanding, but they try to understand still, even despite the misunderstandings. But here, it's more of the engagement to globalize the theoretical consumption. So as Zizek became hyper-relatable, the complete historical context was often lost or faded away. Okay. And here are some discussion questions. So, to what extent can Japan's early post-war democratization be meaningfully compared with Sovietization in Eastern Europe? This was a very interesting question, I believe. And how did the East Asian Cold War conditions limit or redirect the trajectories observed in Europe? And does the Japanese case suggest a distinct form of cultural solidarity in the late Cold War time in case of Polish Solidarity Support Group? Or how should we interpret this kind of popularity of thinkers like Zizek in Japan? Is it a kind of continuation of engagement with the region to a certain extent, or this is a kind of a symptom of decontextualized global consumption? And finally, I just ask this question. Is this kind of sporadic nature of reception is a failure to systematize Eastern European thought, but a historically grounded way of thinking through difference? So Hallyu, actually, I forgot to mention, but Hallyu used the word patchwork of the ideas. So he knew that when he was receiving many things from outside, this only can become patchwork. And patchwork is actually the nature of one of the Japanese thought, let's say, because we only could interpret things, and we have to even like establish the words like society, philosophy, science in a borrowed term. So how this kind of fragmented understanding or historically can be historically appropriate form of reception, where the question of modernity was still to be reconstructed. So yes, this is the end of my presentation and the beginning of our discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this wonderfully rich and analytical presentation. Not at all patchworky, I have to say. But also thank you for, I don't think anyone has ever done the job of the moderator for them. So I don't, I have my own questions, and maybe I can just ask one of them before opening the discussion. But also all of these are really wonderful questions, we thank you for opening yourself up to what you think that the main issues that come out of your presentations. So my question has to do a bit with the themes that were picked up, okay, you have systematized them as well in the conclusions, but as I was listening to you during the presentation, I was thinking that, okay, like these issues are nation and empire, then power, and then for the last one, kind of like civil society, politics, this kind of political engagement. And I understand why, like I can see how each of them are very organically connected to the experience of state socialism. But I also wonder whether there was no engagement with, let's say, the more kind of immediately positive claims of socialism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And maybe one of the most obvious ones would be the issue of women's emancipation, women's engagement in productive labor, and the promise of socializing the work of social reproduction, the work of social reproduction. And you know, this is very much a bit of a story of men reading, translating, and talking about men.
Yes.
So I wonder, was there nothing of the reception of one of these really core big claims of socialism in Japan in any form? And if so, who? And in what kind of combinations? And okay, maybe I put this out there for now.
Okay.
And it's also connected to what authors from Eastern Europe
Mm-hmm.
might have been translated or read that were not the men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. First, I have to say two things just before answering your question directly. Here, I focused or used the term East European or East Central European. Just these two terms I kind of use I mean, both could mean almost the same type of region. And here, of course, I don't include, or in my term, there is no space for the, let's say, Soviet Union, because Soviet Union is a different, let's say, model to look up or to look for different things in. And here I maybe should have said in the beginning, but there are very many ways to engage with socialist ideas in Japan. Of course, first model, Soviet Union, China, China, and their own traditional socialist, and Eastern Central European, and or Latin America, other Asian countries. So when people say socialist ideas, it doesn't automatically become Soviet, let's say, or one single ideas. So this is the first thing. And the second thing, I intentionally or in the end avoided to talk about or didn't include in this presentation about the reception of 1956 and 1968. And but this was also a huge topic. And this, especially the 1956 case, directly connected with the formation of the new left in Japan. And 1968 later on also had a huge influence on the student protests. They resonated a lot, of course. And by saying that, I come to the question, to yours, the more direct reception of the, let's say, socialist emancipation, like women's emancipation, and so on. I have to say that I have to still look into a lot of sources on this part. And it's men talking about the men, and this is very sad. But there are, of course, like like Soviet women. There's actually the very one name I can come up with as a kind of sort of exception, although she went to the Soviet Union already in the pre-war time, as far as I know, if I'm not mistaken. Yuriko Miyamoto, she was also kind of a communist, and she went to Moscow, and of course she found the reality was not always super great, but still she actually wrote a lot of essays and reflections and introduction of the ideas of women's emancipation to Japan. And this was probably the direct case where women talked about the women in the Soviet Union. But that I must say this was a rare case. And this is a good discussion point. So I say just two things in connection with that. Japan is still highly dominated by men, and the men culture is huge, and I mean even more so during that time. And I must say, like all very much trying to find out women's voice is very difficult there. But recently, this is the second point, there was very prominent bande dessinée. So BD comic was out about 1968 protest of women students in Tokyo. So these kind of things were coming out right now, but not yet fully discovered. And about the East to Central Europe, unfortunately, as far as I saw, there are a few figures, of course, there are a few notable people, and there are a few famous people who were in Poland or who were in Czech, who were in Czechoslovakia, who were in Hungary, and some of them were women, but they oftentimes just accompanied. For instance, Kudo's wife, she also was a writer, and she wrote 2 essays based on her time in Warsaw. And these essays are very fun to read. But she always said, like, my husband was meeting with intellectuals, I was just cooking, I was sitting with my cats in the kitchen, and this kind of discrepancy is very visible in her narrative of herself too. Yeah.
Questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really fascinating. But one a little bit more specific question, maybe you mentioned a little bit about this connection to Yugoslavia after the Balkan War, however you call it. I was wondering, you had Giles there, so the translation from 57, which I suppose was done from English anyway.
Yeah.
From the English publication. Could you find any contacts, either personal contacts or maybe just inspirations with Yugoslavia in this early period? So the 50s, maybe early 60s.
This I don't actually know. I cannot answer. I have to look into the information, or I have to ask my fellow Yugoslav researchers in Japan, because they may know something. In Yugoslav, okay. I know some people in Hungary or something like that, but if it's Yugoslav case, I am not sure. Actually, those people who translated all those works I checked their names. Often they retired, even they retracted themselves from the academia, or I couldn't find the solid records of
the translators' work.
Yeah, of their works and so on, so on. And sometimes it's notable. Like, let's say it's just a professor emeritus of this university, that university, but sometimes it's very, very difficult to track down the information and why they could publish this and why they got interested in the first place of those things. So that's also why I call this as a kind of a sporadic trajectory and sporadic reception, let's say, because I think they have enough reasons, as I mentioned in this presentation. Throughout the presentation, there are some hinges that they could hook themselves on the subject. But of course, individual cases, this we need to investigate a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you. This was really fascinating. I have a few questions. I'll only make 2. One thing that I missed that appeared only very briefly was Lukács. And I was kind of searching for when History and Class Consciousness was translated to Japanese. At least what I've been able to Google here, maybe it's wrong, is that it was in the late 50s, which is very special already, because I say that because many of the things you said is the timeline and the actors are very similar to Latin American, to the Latin American reception of the same work. It's kind of very similar actors, even if the context, it's US hegemony, but in the capitalism that is not working, and in Japan it's working very well. So we could definitely, well.
Yeah. I wonder if it's a good thing or not, but yes.
Exactly, I totally agree.
Yeah.
So is that part of the post-56 maybe reaction? Because if it's in the late 50s, it's one of the first in the world. It's really fascinating already.
Actually, yes. Yeah, please continue.
But this leads me to the second question, which is, I think it's very interesting to look at these intellectuals or the reception from this standpoint, the translation of these works from authors under state socialism. But I was curious about what else is in the library of these authors, because if it's the same as Latin America, it's a mix. There's kind of Kojic, but maybe there's some Sartre, and there's some West and East people are not just they're live. Even if it's totally legitimate that you only look at the East Europeans. The libraries were more of a mix, right? And I was curious what else was in there. And just to go to the question that Adela raised, one way to find the women would be, for instance, to see when Alexandra Kollontai was translated to Japanese, and if she had some kind of revival in the 60s and 70s,
Yeah.
which is the case in these other places. I also asked myself questions about Agnes Heller, because she's in this kind of humanist frame in that time, right? So maybe this way you can find who brought them, you find the women in a way, right?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. To the first question, unfortunately, I have to say that Lukács' reception had a much more long history since the 1920s.
Wow.
Yes. So his works are already translated very early on from German. I mean, I must emphasize that the German, Japan, this intellectual tie was huge thing. I mean, that resulted in a very bad thing. Yeah. And but still, like so the cultural influence of the German writings and indeed very much prevalent everywhere, and it's visible. And actually, there is a very good article which I've read recently in preparation for this presentation. It's like there's actually how Lukács was translated, how it was received. There's some articles on this topic exactly, and I found that there's already some articles were translated in the 1920s, and then later, already in the 1930s, his name was quite known throughout all this Bloom these and so on. So
Wow.
So this is one thing, and the library issue as for the intellectuals and what they were reading, actually, of course, they don't discriminate anything, and especially I think in Japan there was no limitation of finding and buying even those kind of books everywhere from on earth. So I'm sure that they have not limited shelf of East Central European thinkers. They probably have bunches of different type of readings. But interestingly, the lack of Asian authors, let's say, like Southeast Asian authors, Hindu authors, something like that. I must say, this comes much later. I think this is also related to the kind of colonial consciousness and or simply the circulation issues. People didn't pay attention to those writers from the marginalized peripheral areas, let's say. Yeah. And thank you for the suggestion for this finding the women, searching for women. This is indeed, I mean, we have to kind of situate them and try to find them. And it's already a sad thing that we have to find them, but still, I mean, it must have been through some connections all the time, and that could be one thing.
Any questions about Zizek?
But the hyper-relatability, that's totally brilliant, but it's one more reason, I think, for us to appeal to Marco to situate him in Slovenia. Like, why is he hyper-relatable is the perfect way to define what happened to his reception, which totally blurs the background. I thought that was brilliant.
So I think maybe in a way I'm just guessing here that all this kind of post-Yugoslav situation is just kind of stage behind Zizek. His wonderful cases and his perverted humor and so on.
But
So,
doesn't it, or like, don't they look quite weird, like how they promote and package Zizek in this way? Because these are actually the upper one, the blue one is Against Progress in 2024, if I'm not mistaken, and the below one is, what was the title? Too Late to Awake or something. Too Late to Awaken. It was publication of 2023. We cannot follow Zizek anyway. So anyway, the entire work, but I mean, it's packaged in a way. I mean, at least to my eye, kind of he's a moral defender of this world, or he has a kind of intellectual authority, can talk about Ukrainian war and all kinds of like AI issues and something like that. This is kind of visible from the let's say from the cover, and it's a very weird way to package.
So, of course, there's a question. What about his earlier work, like Sublime Object?
Yeah, those are serious works. Let's say on more serious works on film theory and philosophy. We can of course find in a more from academic publishers. This one is from one of the media publications, so I think they have a different strategy for selling books, I must say.
But just quite quickly, I mean, he also sells himself as a person who can talk about anything.
Exactly.
So
And I think this kind
a
of
new book on quantum physics.
Yeah. So, and I think this is the case that he, exactly kind of took his wish to present himself as such is represented here.
Okay, on the question of Yugoslavia, I will read out a question that we received in the Zoom chat.
Okay.
It is from Nakazawa Takuya, who is a researcher of contemporary history of Yugoslavia and currently an assistant professor at the University for Economics. And one of the chapters in their bachelor's thesis was about Kabel. So the question is, first, the context. In post-war Japan, research on self-managing socialism was very active, with 4 books each translated from the works of Mula Vangelas and Edward Kardej, and at least 3 researchers who learned Serbo-Croatian and wrote books about Yugoslavia's economy. One of them wrote a book on self-managing socialism just last year. So while such economists were institutionally conservative in the sense that they obtained academic positions and wrote books with extensive bibliographies, they also embodied post-war Japanese progressivism by finding an alternative in the system of self-managing socialism and actively trying to introduce it to Japanese society.
Yeah.
The question is, will you extend the scope of your research to include economists such as these as well?
Good question, and congratulations for your appointment, Professor Nakazawa, right now. Yeah, I mean, just we know each other. If I'm not mistaken with a different person, but I'm sure. And okay, let's say economics is kind of actually the very direct contact with the Soviet Union and Chinese case as well. It's probably weird enough, but it's a way that converted, and it's a kind of the working way around. And because, I mean, to a certain extent, Marxist thought on economics, that was one prevalent field and one still strong field that had been in some department of economics, could appoint such person who was specializing in Marxist economics in the 1970s, 1980s, even 1990s to a certain state universities in Japan. And this was not weird at all, because they do serious researches on different type of economies, which might be useful to the capitalist economies. In this case, like Soviet or Yugoslav case, and to a certain case, this Polish case initially was introduced as this kind of self-organized labor union movement. Later, they found out it's slightly different orientation, but still. So these kind of things were pretty much, I would say, indeed normal as a subject of investigation throughout the post-war period. But I don't say I include them because, at least to my presentation, what I presented in today's presentation, because, or maybe we could include because it's also kind of translated and mediated through certain framework of ideas, but the reception was indeed quite different. It's a good question. I do not answer right now, right away, perhaps. But one thing I can say is there's a disciplinary difference, I think, compared to other like literature, thought, philosophy. And that disciplinary difference may have different, maybe it would be better to find some kind of a framework other than the framework that I presented today.
You mentioned that Radovan Richter was never translated in full, but that he circulated quite well. His ideas were debated, and that made me wonder how did this whole discussion about technology, the scientific technological revolution, the possible humanization of labor or further alienation of labor through automatization, how did this discussion translate in the Japanese context, if at all?
Okay, I didn't really look into what the people wrote about Richter. I just checked if he exists, and oftentimes, but very often mentioned in this context, exactly like technological advancement, automation, and not necessarily Marxist literature, just it's from the economy reports and maybe some of the reviews. That I think that credibility comes certainly from certain Western maybe academics who are in the field and who probably wrote about him, and probably that was kind of cited and yeah. But I think many people have read, and because there are libraries who had Richter's book in English, German, and so on. So at least, if not directly, quite a few people had an access to it.
More questions? All right. In that case, Anna, thank you so much. This was wonderful. We are happy to have you here for another week with us. No more panettone. This is the beginning.
Okay.
And before saying goodbye, let me just announce the next History on the Edge lecture, which will take place on February 11, also at 3 p.m. By Robert Gioeli from the Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm, Sweden. The title is 1968, the year America embraced sprawl and destroyed the planet. Notice the question again. So looking forward to seeing you again then, and I thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.